What happened to you?
I got maced.
You got maced?
By the police.
And what happened? You were trying to go inside the Capitol?
Yeah, I made it like a foot inside and they pushed me out and they maced me.
What's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Elizabeth. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee.
And why did you want to go in?
We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Seth Andrews, and this is In Time.
Hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. Excuse me. We a little surprised to be here. Everyone's a little surprised to be here. I guess this is the M. Night Shyamalan of hearings. The schedule has sort of vaguely come out for the rest of the hearings that they were going to resume on July 11th. That ostensibly gave us a lot of time to think about other topics, other events. We certainly have a show tonight on microbiology and nanobots. I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be 10 p.m. Eastern Standard. And we also have two other things that we really need to cover here on In Time. The first is the war in Ukraine. Russia has used the vacuum bomb. Where there's some confusion over sort of the vacuum bomb versus the other hyperbaric weapons and the missile system that essentially has the same effect. They did deploy that. They admitted to deploying it. They bragged about deploying it. And, we know that they've deployed it, but at this point, they're not even really hiding the war crimes. So, it looks like the hearing is... Let me, because we're getting the audio of that in now, so I'm going to mute the hearing, and let's bring up the shield on that so you guys can see it. But we need to get into what's going on in Ukraine. Unfortunately, things are deteriorating for Ukraine. They have, for the first part of this war, they have done spectacularly well. Russia seems to have learned some lessons from the first part of this and is unfortunately starting to slowly, but nonetheless, noticeably make ground. So we're going to discuss that. The other thing that we really are going to have to cover at this point is what's going on in the United States regarding Roe v. Wade. The good news is I think it's starting to seep into the public consciousness, especially thanks to the concurrent opinion by Clarence Thomas. It's starting to seep into the public consciousness that this is very, very serious and even more serious than just Roe v. Wade, which is serious enough. It's the linchpin to legislation over the last 50 years. It's an extraordinarily serious decision. The Washington Post has recently come out with an article on, believe it or not, the compassion or what's the word I'm looking for? I'll use compassion since I can't think of the other word right now of Sharia law, at least in this regard. Muslims are speaking out and pointing out that actually abortion is permissible in Sharia law, usually at least up to 120 days, and that the U.S. is now one of the only countries, I think it's the only industrialized nation that does not recognize it as a right. Now, we haven't banned it on a federal level. There are states that are banning it. There are states in which some of those bans are actually already now being postponed by judges. It's a patchwork of consequences here, so I think we're going to have to go over it. But the notion that even Sharia law recognizes it as a right is quite stunning. And so I think we're going to have that discussion. So we've got a lot planned for the next week. I have been on a conference, and I do want to point out, at least for a moment here. Oh, it looks like, are we going to be seeing the witnesses? No, not yet. We'll talk about this hearing in a second. I do want to point out, I had a delightful time at Tang's Better Conference. We had Oz on this show. We've had some members of Tang on this show before. They had a conference in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I went, met, and a lot of people thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great to meet people that I've seen on YouTube and who have only been in 2D for so long. We met, had a marvelous time. I got to spend time with Dr. Josh, who we've had on, Digital Hammurabi, who we've had on. And the good news is, they were all at least as delightful in person as they were on the show. So I'd like to personally thank everyone at Tang who worked hard. And I think there are a lot of people who worked very hard. Pasta Mike, Biddy Buddha, numbers who don't always get quite the recognition for the more obvious faces and the ones who organized this. I'd like to thank everyone who helped do that. It was delightful, but most importantly, I'd like to thank Oz, who I think really, for his first conference ever, it ran a lot like one that's been done, at least 3 or 4 times, and it's just, where you'd think they'd worked out a lot of the kinks and done this before, and you wouldn't have guessed that this was his first one. So it was a lot of fun. I'd like to thank them for making me feel so welcome, and I'd like to thank everybody I met there, some of them still in this audience. So, and the speeches were great about how to improve the discourse between specifically atheists and theists. It applies to, I think, a lot of discourse. It is a topic which I think people know I'm interested in improving communication and having better understanding between people in general. So it was a delight to be there, and I want to thank everybody. So having said all that, what's going on today? Well, and Clarence Thomas. So we got to cover. I mean, Clarence Thomas is going off the deep end. I think he is about to be in very serious trouble, and I think he maybe is trying to preempt that by being kind of an ass online and trying to make it so people are talking about other things than what he may be facing. I think there's a better likelihood than not that he's off the Supreme Court by the end of the year. I think it's better likelihood than not. That's my opinion. We'll get into that. So the hearings are going to start presumably in about 8 minutes. So what is this hearing? Your guess is as good as mine. We were told that they would resume again July 11th. The reason for the pause was that they were getting a whole bunch new information and new evidence. I'd like to remind you of a few things. One, they've made it clear that this is just their preliminary findings. They're not done with their investigation. They were planning on continuing depositions regardless. They just felt that they had, at this point, enough information to make preliminary findings known. And what that really means is that they've reached their conclusions. They're wrapping up, but there's enough there to make pretty significant charges against a number of people, including the former president of the United States. So, having said that, as a result of this, a lot of things are shaking loose. One of the most notable one is Matt Gaetz, who had been sort of a very, I don't want to say stalwart defender of the president, but certainly had been involved and been keeping quiet. He just lost his primary in the on the Republican side for his seat, and and Trump endorsed his opponent. He's lost, and a day later said that he would like to testify, but will do so only if it's public. That's a very concerning sign, and the reason that's concerning is while I'm sure he has something of value, his motive in this is revenge, and you do not put somebody up there whose motive is revenge if you can possibly help it, because if that comes out, if that comes across, it paints the entire committee with that brush. It taints all the hearings. So there's been some speculation that he would be up here. It's possible he has something explosive, but they would want to they'd want to get his testimony under oath beforehand. And even after they've gotten it, they probably wouldn't want to put him up here, because if it looks like he's doing this out of revenge, the hearings take a serious blow. So my suspicion is that's not it. So the question is, what are we going to see today? My suspicion is, somebody said this in the live chat, I think they're probably right. My suspicion is this is going to be the news crew. We learned that this news crew had been with Trump for 6 weeks up prior to the election. They held a lot of interviews that we didn't know about, interviews with the Trump family. They had access to members of the Trump family. Presumably, some of this has gotten Ivanka in a little hot water, including possibly perjury. I don't know. But that's going to be my guess. They're independent. They're probably reasonably safe to put on. Some of their footage has already been used. And we know, too, that they were actually recording when Pence received a request from Nancy Pelosi to invoke the 25th Amendment. This, as you may recall, is the amendment to have the president removed from office. Usually there's actually, the president could actually invoke the 25th Amendment himself to remove himself temporarily. But ostensibly in this case, it was to get the cabinet to vote and have him removed because he was no longer capable of fulfilling his role. Pence was not entertaining the idea. So we'll see. Anyways, we have no idea what to expect today. This was, they just announced it. So we're going to do this one again. We have tonight nanobots and microbiology. Looking forward to that. And then tomorrow we are going to go state by state and cover what is going on with the consequences of the fall of Roe v. Wade. It's a mess. There's a patchwork everywhere. Again, fortunately, it's starting to seep into the public consciousness that it's not just Roe v. Wade. It's everything, almost all the way to somebody had put, maybe they're going back as far as Plessy versus Ferguson. I don't think they're going that far back. I did note they're not going back to Loving versus Virginia, which was the right of interracial couples to marry. I noticed Thomas didn't bring that one up, but he did bring up gay rights and even the right to same-sex relationships. It's quite stunning. The argument that he's using is really that it's up to the states to decide. Oh, dear Lord. We'll get into that. At any rate, we're expecting this to start at any minute. So let's, yep. All right. We're going to, if we get taken down, which unfortunately appears to be a distinct possibility, the first three of these that we covered had no issues. The fourth and the fifth were struck live by YouTube. We were able to survive the appeal. It wasn't a problem. We're perfectly within our rights to stream this, but for whatever reason, YouTube has repeatedly been taking the stream down live as we're airing, and then it's just a in-time management trying to see if we can get the stream restored, and we've had intermittent success with it. We have a backup stream. The backup stream is pinned to the top of the live chat, so if we go down, you can go there. The live chat will continue to operate even if we go down, and the live chat will display on the screen. So, do with that what you will. My hope is that we're not gonna have any issues. So far, as I said before, 3 of the streams we were good with. The last 2, it was a constant battle throughout the stream to see if we could keep it up. So we'll see. Let's see. Is Azandring? Last time I said Azandring isn't here, he had snuck in without my observing it. So let's see. Now Azandring has not shown up yet, and so we don't have the panel. That's fine. Anyways, I am as curious as everyone else to see what they say. I will say this too. They've done a very good job with optics. They're keenly aware that they are selling the public on this idea. If the public can get behind it, the committee is safer in when it comes to the results of the November election. The conservatives have said they will shut the committee down. It's over if they win, and despite I'd love to say that I think conservatives aren't going to win and flip it, but I think they will. If they do, the committee's over. So they really have to assume that they're dead as of the election, and they're going to try to get it finished by then. Most of them, their careers are in fact over, regardless of what happens. I think that's certainly true for the Vice Chair Cheney, who will almost certainly lose her primaries exclusively as a result of her being on this committee. She's down, last I saw, 26 points. She's not going to come back from that on the primaries, so she's going to probably lose her primary. This is going to be, I think, her last major act in Congress for a family that has been in politics for so long and with whom I've had some pretty significant disagreements in the past. It's still staggering to watch that doing the right thing has consequences. Having said that, if it didn't, everybody would always do it. What makes the right thing so important to do is that the consequences usually make it hard. If it were easy, we'd all do it all the time. So that's what makes it important. And I've been very impressed by the people who've testified and by the people who've been running it. So we'll see. I agree that sometimes that other people are right, but usually only when they already have agreed with what I've said. If they haven't started it, I don't know. We'll see. End of the year, tight. If they haven't started. Oh dear Lord! You'll have to excuse me. The cough has gotten worse. As I said, I was at a conference. There's a lot of smoking going on, a lot of talking. So, we'll see. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think Chief Justice Roberts is. He's vanilla, and I know he doesn't want to be vanilla. He wants to be remembered as Supreme Court justices. It's a legacy, and he wants to have a legacy. But so far, I mean, people have been resigning the what is it? What's the name of the judicial? I've forgotten, but a lot of judges have been upset that Roberts has not been holding his court together. He had said that he wanted his court to represent incremental changes to the law, not anything huge and significant, and he didn't even vote. He wouldn't go down for or against on the Roe v. Wade decision. So, I think is he going to rise to the challenge of doing something about Thomas, or is he just going to sit there and go with the flow? I'm inclined to think he's not going to rise to the challenge, but he doesn't want somebody impeached on his watch. So my suspicion is he's going to try to get Thomas to resign. We'll see. It's not to that point yet. It really depends on what the committee does over the next few days. It may be that this is also about Ginny Thomas. I'm not sure. I think it's going to be the documentary crew. The only reason to make about Ginny Thomas at this point and to add a surprise hearing on that would probably be just political. To do an end run attack on the Roe v. Wade thing. So let's see what they're saying.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during this hearing.
Holding on. Okay.
Good afternoon. In our hearings over the previous weeks, the Select Committee has laid out the details of a multi-part pressure campaign driven by the former president aimed at overturning the results of the 2020 presidential election and blocking the transfer of power. We've shown that this effort was based on a lie that the election was stolen, tainted by widespread fraud, Donald Trump's big lie. In the weeks ahead, the committee will hold additional hearings about how Donald Trump summoned a mob of his supporters to Washington, spurred them to march on the Capitol, and failed to take meaningful action to quell the violence as it was unfolding on January 6th. However, in recent days, the Select Committee has obtained new information dealing with what was going on in the White House on January 6th and in the days prior. Specific detailed information about what the former president and his top aides were doing and saying in those critical hours. First-hand details of what transpired in the office of the White House Chief of Staff, just steps from the Oval Office as the threats of violence became clear, and indeed, violence ultimately descended on the Capitol in the attack on American democracy. It's important that the American people hear that information immediately. That's why, in consultation with the Vice Chair, I've recalled the committee for today's hearing. As you've seen and heard in our earlier hearings, the Select Committee has developed a massive body of evidence thanks to the many hundreds of witnesses who have voluntarily provided information relevant to our investigation. It hasn't always been easy to get that information because the same people who drove the former president's pressure campaign to overturn the election are now trying to cover up the truth about January 6th. But thanks to the courage of certain individuals, the truth won't be buried. The American people won't be left in the dark. Our witness today, Ms. Cassie Hutchinson, has embodied that courage. I won't get into a lot of detail about Ms. Hutchinson's testimony will show. I'll allow her words to speak for themselves, and I hope everyone at home will listen very closely. First, I'll recognize our distinguished Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming, for any opening statements she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In our first 5 hearings, the committee has heard from a significant number of Republicans, including former Trump administration Justice Department officials, Trump campaign officials, several members of President Trump's White House staff, a prominent conservative judge, and several others. Today's witness, Ms. Cassidy Hutchinson, is another Republican and another former member of President Trump's White House staff. Certain of us in the House of Representatives recall that Ms. Hutchinson once worked for House Republican Whip Steve Scalise, but she is also a familiar face on Capitol Hill because she held a prominent role in the White House Legislative Affairs Office and later was the principal aide to President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. Ms. Hutchinson has spent considerable time up here on Capitol Hill representing the Trump administration, and we welcome her back. Up until now, our hearings have each been organized to address specific elements of President Trump's plan to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we are departing somewhat from that model because Ms. Hutchinson's testimony touches on several important and cross-cutting topics that are relevant to each of our future hearings. In her role working for the White House Chief of Staff, Ms. Hutchinson handled a vast number of sensitive issues. She worked in the West Wing, several steps down the hall from the Oval Office. Ms. Hutchinson spoke daily with members of Congress, with high-ranking officials in the administration, with senior White House staff, including Mr. Meadows, with White House counsel, lawyers, and with Mr. Tony Ornato, who served as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. She also worked on a daily basis with members of the Secret Service who were posted in the White House. In short, Ms. Hutchinson was in a position to know a great deal about the happenings in the Trump White House. Ms. Hutchinson has already sat for 4 videotaped interviews with committee investigators, and we thank her very much for her cooperation and for her courage. We will cover certain, but not all, relevant topics within Ms. Hutchinson's knowledge today. Again, our future hearings will supply greater detail, putting the testimony today in a broader and more complete context. Today, you will hear Ms. Hutchinson relate certain first-hand observations of President Trump's conduct on January 6th. You will also hear new information regarding the actions and statements of Mr. Trump's senior advisors that day, including his Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and his White House counsel. And we will begin to examine evidence bearing on what President Trump and members of the White House staff knew about the prospect for violence on January 6th, even before that violence began. To best communicate the information the committee has gathered, we will follow the practice of our...
All right, so just so everyone's aware, so Mark Meadows was the Chief of Staff, and we're aware was given by Eastman the 7 points memo on how to overturn the election. He ended up following much of that, and we don't know exactly what he was doing or saying during 9/11. Wow. During January 6th, but we have a significant amount of evidence that he was involved and very aware of how bad things were, and this is going to be his well, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what she. I don't think it was executive assistant, but she worked directly under him, and we've heard rumors that she has some pretty damning stuff on her cell phone. His cell phone, I think, was seized by the FBI yesterday, so we will see what she has to say, but she has actually probably the potential to be one of the most damaging witnesses we've seen to any individual other than Eastman so far. So let's see what she's got to say.
Our recent hearings, playing videotape testimony from Ms. Hutchinson and others, and also posing questions to Ms. Hutchinson live. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Our witness today is Ms. Cassie Hutchinson, who served in the Trump administration in the White House Office of Legislative Affairs from 2019 to 2020, and as a special assistant to the President in the White House Chief of Staff's office from March 2020 through January 2021. I will now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise her right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole? I'd like to start with a few questions about your background. These are some photographs we've obtained highlighting your career. These show you with members of Congress, including 𝐒𝐚𝐥𝐥-𝐈𝐧 𝐋𝐚𝐦, as well as the White House with leader Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan. Others show you with the President and members of Congress aboard Air Force One. Before you worked in the White House, you worked on Capitol Hill for Representative Steve Scalise, the Republican whip, and Senator Ted Cruz. And then in 2019, you moved to the White House and served there until the end of the Trump administration in 2020. When you started at the White House, you served in the Office of Legislative Affairs. We understand that you were initially hired as a staff assistant, but were soon promoted to a position of greater responsibility. Can you explain your role for the committee?
When I moved over to the White House Chief of Staff's office with Mr. Meadows when he became the 4th Chief of Staff, it's difficult to describe a typical day. I was a special assistant to the President and an advisor to the Chief of Staff. The days depended on what the President was doing that day, and that's kind of how my portfolio was reflected. I had a lot of outreach with members of Congress, senior cabinet officials. I would work on policy issues with relevant internal components and members on the Hill, as well as security protocol at the White House complex for Mr. Meadows and the President.
And then you received another promotion in March 2020. At that time, you became the principal aide to the new White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
What did a typical day look like for you in your work with Mr. Meadows?
It varied with what was going on. We spent a lot of time on the Hill. I spent time on the Hill independently too, as I was his liaison for Capitol Hill. We did a lot of presidential travel engagements, but mostly I was there to serve what Chief of Staff needed, and a lot of times what the Chief of Staff needed was a reflection of what the President's schedule was detailed to do that day.
So is it fair to say that you spoke regularly in your position, both with members of Congress and with senior members of the Trump administration?
That's correct. That's a fair assessment, sir.
And would you say that in your work with Mr. Meadows, you were typically in contact with him and others in the White House throughout the day?
That's correct, sir. Mr. Meadows and I were in contact almost pretty much throughout every day, consistently.
Although so much of grave importance happens in the West Wing of the White House, it's quite a small building. Above me on the screen, you can see a map of the first floor of the West Wing of the White House. On the right, you can see the President's Oval Office. On the left, the Chief of Staff's office suite. Within the Chief of Staff's office suite is the heart of the West Wing, was your desk, which was between the Vice President's office, Ms. Kirshner's office, and the Oval Office. Ms. Hutchinson, is this an accurate depiction of where you were located?
It's accurate. It's a lot smaller than it looks.
Absolutely. Ms. Hutchins, this is a photo that shows the short distance between your office and the President's Oval Office. And it only takes 5 to 10 seconds or so to walk down the hall from your office to the Oval Office. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Pursuant to the Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we will begin today with an exchange that first provided Ms. Hutchinson a tangible sense of the ongoing planning for the events of January 6th. On January 2nd, 4 days before the attack on our Capitol, President Trump's lead lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, was meeting with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and others. Ms. Hutchinson, do you remember Mr. Giuliani meeting with Mr. Meadows on January 2nd, 2021?
I do. He met with Mr. Meadows in the evening of January 2nd, 2021.
And we understand that you walked Mr. Giuliani out of the White House that night, and he talked to you about January 6th. What do you remember him saying?
As Mr. Giuliani and I were walking to his vehicles that evening, he looked at me and said something to the effect of, "Cass, are you excited for the 6th? It's going to be a great day." I remember looking at him and saying, "Rudy, could you explain what's happening on the 6th? He had responded something to the effect of, "We're going to the Capitol. It's going to be great. The president's going to be there. He's going to look powerful. He's going to be with the members. He's going to be with the senators. Talk to the chief about it. Talk to the chief about it. He knows about it."
And did you go back then up to the West Wing and tell Mr. Meadows about your conversation with Mr. Giuliani?
I did. After Mr. Giuliani had left the campus that evening, I went back up to our office, and I found Mr. Meadows in his office on the couch. He was scrolling through his phone. I remember leaning against the doorway and saying, "I had an interesting conversation with Rudy, Mark. Sounds like we're going to go to the Capitol." He didn't look up from his phone and said something to the effect of, "There's a lot going on, Cass, but I don't know. Things might get real bad on January 6th.
Ms. Hutchinson, Mr. Meadows is engaged in litigation with the committee to try to avoid testifying here. What was your reaction when he said to you things might get real bad?
In the days before January 2nd, I was apprehensive about the 6th. I had heard general plans for a rally. I had heard tentative movements to potentially go to the Capitol. But when hearing Rudy's take on January 6th and then Mark's response, that evening was the first moment that I remember feeling scared and nervous for what could happen on January 6th. And I had a deeper concern for what was happening with the planning aspects of it.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. Today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the events of January 5th and 6th at the White House. But to begin and to frame the discussion, I want to talk about a conversation that you had with Mr. John Ratcliffe, the Director of National Intelligence. And you had this conversation in December of 2020. Mr. Ratcliffe was nominated by President Trump to oversee U.S. intelligence, our U.S. intelligence community. And before his appointment, Mr. Ratcliffe was a Republican member of Congress. As you will see on this clip, Director Ratcliffe's comments in December of 2020 were prescient.
My understanding was Director Ratcliffe didn't want much to do with the post-election period. Director Ratcliffe felt that it wasn't something that the White House should be pursuing. It felt it was dangerous for the president's legacy. He had expressed to me that he was concerned that it could spiral out of control and potentially be dangerous, either for our democracy or the way that things were going for the 6th.
When you say it wasn't something the White House should be pursuing, what's the it?
Trying to fight the results of the election, finding missing ballots, pressuring filing lawsuits in certain states where there didn't seem to be significant evidence, and reaching out to state legislatures about So pretty much the way that the White House is handling the post-election period, he felt that there could be dangerous repercussions in terms of precedent set for elections, for our democracy, for the six. He was hoping that we would concede.
So, Ms. Hutchinson, now we're going to turn to certain information that was available before January 4th and what the Trump administration and the president knew about the potential for violence before January 6th. On the screen, you will see an email received by Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue on January 4th from the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. Mr. Donahue testified in our hearings last week. The email identifies apparent planning by those coming to Washington on January 6th to, quote, occupy federal buildings, and to discussions of, quote, invading the Capitol building. Here's what Mr. Donahue said to us.
And we knew that if you have tens of thousands of very upset people showing up in Washington, D.C., that there was potential for violence.
The U.S. Secret Service was looking at similar information and watching the planned demonstrations. In fact, their intelligence division sent several emails to White House personnel, like Deputy Chief of Staff Tony Ornato and the head of the President's Protective Detail, Robert Engel, including certain materials listing events like those on the screen. The White House continued to receive updates about planned demonstrations, including information regarding the Proud Boys organizing and planning to attend events on January 6th. Although Ms. Hutchinson has no detailed knowledge of any planning involving the Proud Boys for January 6th, she did note this.
I recall hearing the word Oath Keeper and hearing the word Proud Boys closer to the planning of the January 6th rally when Mr. Giuliani would be around.
On January 3rd, the Capitol Police issued a special event assessment. In that document, the Capitol Police noted that the Proud Boys and other groups planned to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th and indicated that, quote, unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters as they were previously, but rather Congress itself is the target on the 6th. Of course, we all know now that the Proud Boys showed up on January 6th, marched from the Washington Monument to the Capitol that day, and led the riotous mob to invade and occupy our Capitol. Ms. Hutchinson, I want to play you a clip of one of our meetings when you described a call on January 4th that you received from National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien on the same topic, potential violence on January 6th.
I received a call from Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor. He had asked if he could speak with Mr. Meadows about potential words of violence that he was hearing that were potentially going to happen on the Hill on January 6th. I had asked if he had connected with Tony Ornato because Tony Ornato had a conversation with him, with Mark, about that topic. Robert had said, I'll talk to Tony, and then I don't know if Robert ever connected with Mark about the issue.
Ms. Hutchinson, can you describe for us Mr. Ornato's responsibilities as Deputy Chief of Staff?
The Deputy Chief of Staff position at the White House for operations is arguably one of the most important positions that somebody can hold. They're in charge of all security protocol for the campus and all presidential protectees, primarily the president and the first family, but anything that requires security for any individual that has presidential protection, so the Chief of Staff or the National Security Advisor, as well as the Vice President's team too. Tony would oversee all of that, and he was the conduit for security protocol between White House staff and the United States Secret Service.
Thank you. And you also described a brief meeting between Mr. Ornato and Mr. Meadows on the potential for violence. The meeting was on January 4th. They were talking about the potential for violence on January 6th. Let's listen to a clip of that testimony.
Remember Mr. Ornato had talked to him about intelligence reports. I remember Mr. Ornato coming in and saying that we had intel reports saying that there could potentially be violence on the 6th.
You also told us about reports of violence and weapons that the Secret Service were receiving on the night of January 5th and throughout the day on January 6th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There are reports that police in Washington, D.C. had arrested several people with firearms or ammunition following a separate pro-Trump rally in Freedom Plaza on the evening of January 5th. Are those some of the reports that you recall hearing about?
They are.
Of course, the world now knows that the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th had many different types of weapons. When a president speaks, the Secret Service typically requires those attending to pass through metal detectors, known as magnetometers, or mags for short. The Select Committee has learned that people who willingly entered the enclosed area for President Trump's speech were screened so they could attend the rally at the Ellipse. They had weapons and other items that were confiscated: pepper spray, knives, brass knuckles, tasers, body armor, gas masks, batons, blunt weapons. And those were just from the people who chose to go through the security for the president's event on the Ellipse, not the several thousand members of the crowd who refused to go through the mags and watched from the lawn near the Washington Monument. The Select Committee has learned about reports from outside the magnetometers and has obtained police radio transmissions identifying individuals with firearms, including AR-15s, near the Ellipse on the morning of January 6th. Let's listen.
The individual was in a tree. He's going to be a white male, about 6 feet tall, thin build, brown cowboy boots. He's got blue jeans and a blue jean jacket, and underneath the blue jean jacket, the complainants both saw a stock with AR-15. He's going to be with a group of individuals, about 5 to 8 other individuals. 2 of the individuals in that group at the base of the tree, near the porta potties, were wearing green fatigues, green olive drab style fatigues, about 5'8", 5'9", skinny white males, brown cowboy boots. They had Glock-style pistols in their waistband.
8736 with the message that subject, weapon on his right hip. Copy that, he's in the tree.
Motor 1, make sure BPD knows they have an elevated threat in the tree south side of Constitution Avenue. Look for the Don't Tread on Me flag, American flag face mask, cowboy boots, weapon on the right side hip.
I got 3 men walking down the street in fatigue carrying AR-15. Copy at 14th and Independence.
AR-15s at 14th and Independence. As you saw in those emails, the first report that we showed, we now know was sent in the 8 o'clock hour on January 6th. This talked about people in the crowd wearing ballistic helmets and body armor, carrying radio equipment, and military-grade backpacks. The second report we showed you on the screen was sent by the Secret Service in the 11 a.m. hour, and it addressed reports of a man with a rifle near the Ellipse. Ms. Hutchinson, in prior testimony, you described for us a meeting in the White House around 10 a.m. in the morning of January 6th, involving Chief of Staff Meadows and Tony Ornato. Were you in that meeting?
I was.
Let's listen to your testimony about that meeting, and then we'll have some questions.
I think the last time we talked, you mentioned that some of the weapons that people had at the rally included flagpoles, oversized sticks or flagpoles, bear spray. Is there anything else that you recall hearing about that the people who would gather on the Ellipse had?
I recall Tony and I having a conversation with Mark probably around 10 a.m., 10:15 a.m., where I remember Tony mentioning knives, guns in the form of pistols and rifles, bear spray, body armor, spears, and flagpoles. Spears were one item, flagpoles were one item, and then Tony had relayed to me something to the effect of, and these effing people are fastening spears onto the ends of flagpoles.
And Ms. Hutchinson, here's a clip of your testimony regarding Mr. Meadows' response to learning that the rally attendees were armed that day. What was Mark's reaction, Mr. Meadows' reaction to this list of weapons that people had in the crowd?
When Tony and I went in to talk to Mark that morning, Mark was sitting on his couch and on his phone, which was something typical. And I remember Tony just got right into it. I was like, sorry, I just want to let you know, and had informed him, like, this is how many people we have outside the mags right now. These are the weapons that we're known to have. It's possible he listed more weapons off that I just don't recall. And gave him a brief but and concise explanation, but also fairly thorough. And I remember distinctly Mark not looking up from his phone. And I remember Tony finishing his explanation and it taking a few seconds for Mark to say something, to the point where I almost said, Mark, did you hear him? And then Mark chimed in and was like, all right, anything else? Still looking down at his phone. And Tony looked at me and I looked at Tony and Tony said, no, sir, do you have any questions? He's like, what are you hearing? And then I looked at Tony and I was like, sir, he just told you about what was happening down at the rallies. And he was like, yeah, I know. And then he looked up and said, have you talked to the president? And Tony said, yes, sir, he's aware too. He said, all right, good.
He asked Tony if Tony had informed the president.
Yes.
And Tony said, yes, he had. So, Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that Mr. Ornato told the president about weapons at the rally on the morning of January 6th?
That's what Mr. Ornato relayed to me.
And here's how you characterize Mr. Meadows' general response when people raised concerns about what could happen on January 6th.
So at the time, in the days leading up to the 6th, there were lots of public reports about how things might go bad on the 6th, even the potential for violence. If I'm hearing you correctly, what stands out to you is that Mr. Meadows did not share those concerns, or at least did not act on those concerns?
Did not act on those concerns would be accurate.
But other people raised them to him? Like in this exchange, you mentioned that Mr. Ornato pulled him aside.
That's correct.
Ms. Hutchinson, we're going to show now an exchange of texts between you and Deputy Chief of Staff Ornato. And these text messages were exchanged while you were at the ellipse. In one text, you write, but the crowd looks good from this vantage point as long as we get the shot. He was effing furious. And the text messages also stress that President Trump kept mentioning the OTR, an off-the-record movement. We're going to come back and ask you about that in a minute. But could you tell us, first of all, who it is in the text who was furious?
The he in that text that I was referring to was the president.
And why was he furious, Ms. Hutchinson?
He was furious because he wanted the arena that we had on the ellipse to be maxed out at capacity for all attendees. The advance team had relayed to him that the mags were free-flowing. Everybody who wanted to come in had already come in, but he still was angry about the extra space and wanted more people to come in.
And did you go to the rally in the presidential motorcade?
I was there, yes, in the motorcade.
And were you backstage with the president and other members of his staff and family?
I was.
And you told us, Ms. Hutchinson, about particular comments that you heard while you were in the tent area.
When we were in the offstage announce area tent behind the stage, he was very concerned about the shot, meaning the photograph that we would get, because the rally space wasn't full. One of the reasons, which I've previously stated, was because he wanted it to be full and for people to not feel excluded because they'd come far to watch him at the rally. And he felt the mags were at fault for not letting everybody in. But another leading reason, and likely the primary reason, is because he wanted it full and he was angry that we weren't letting people through the mags with weapons, what the Secret Service deems as weapons and our weapons. But when we were in the offstage announce tent, I was part of a conversation I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, you know, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
Just to be clear, Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that the president wanted to take the mags away and said that the armed individuals were not there to hurt him?
That's a fair assessment.
The issue wasn't with the amount of space available in the official rally area only, but instead that people did not want to have to go through the mags. Let's listen to a portion of what you told us about that.
In this particular instance, it wasn't the capacity of our space, it was the mags and the people that didn't want to come through, and that's what Tony had been trying to relay to him that morning. You know, it's not the issues that we encountered on the campaign. We have enough space, or they don't want to come in right now. They have weapons that they don't want confiscated by the Secret Service, and they're fine on the mall. They can see you on the mall, and they want to march straight to the Capitol from the mall.
The president apparently wanted all attendees inside the official rally space and repeatedly said, quote, "They're not here to hurt me." And just to be clear, so he was told again in that conversation, or was he told again in that conversation that people couldn't come through the mags because they had weapons?
Correct.
And that people, and his response was to say they can march to the Capitol from the ellipse.
Something to the effect of, take the effing mags away. They're not here to hurt me. Let them in. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol after the rally's over. They can march from the ellipse. Take the effing mags away. Then they can march to the Capitol.
Ms. Hutchinson, what we saw when those clips were playing were photos provided by the National Archives showing the president in the offstage tent before his speech on the ellipse. You were in some of those photos as well. And I just want to confirm that that is when you heard the president say the people with weapons weren't there to hurt him and that he wanted the Secret Service to remove the magnetometers.
That's correct. In the photos that you displayed, we were standing towards the front of the tent with the TVs, really close to where he would walk out to go onto the stage. These conversations happened 2 to 3 minutes before he took the stage that morning.
Let's reflect on that for a moment. President Trump was aware that a number of the individuals in the crowd had weapons and were wearing body armor. And here's what President Trump instructed the crowd to do.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
And the crowd, as we know, did proceed to the Capitol. It soon became apparent to the Secret Service, including the Secret Service teams in the crowd, along with White House staff, that security at the Capitol would not be sufficient.
I'd had 2 or 3 phone conversations with Mr. Ornato when we were at the ellipse, and then I had 4 men on Mr. Meadows' detail with me in between those individuals and then a few other bodies on the ground, just the Secret Service doing advance. They were getting notifications through their radios, and Mr. Ornato in one phone conversation had called me and said, make sure the chief knows that they're getting closer to the Capitol. It's, they're having trouble stacking bodies.
And Ms. Hutchinson, when you said they were having trouble stacking bodies, did you mean that law enforcement at the Capitol needed more people to defend the Capitol from the rioters?
It was becoming clear to us and to the Secret Service that Capitol police officers were getting overrun at the security barricades outside of the Capitol building, and they were short people to defend the building against the rioters.
And you mentioned that Mr. Ornato was conveying this to you because he wanted you to tell Mr. Meadows. So did you tell Mr. Meadows that people were getting closer to the Capitol and that Capitol Police was having difficulty?
After I had the conversation with Mr. Meadows, after I had the conversation with Mr. Ornato, I went to have the discussion with Mr. Meadows. He was in a secure vehicle at the time making a call. So when I had gone over to the car, I went to open the door to let him know, and he had immediately shut it. I don't know who he was speaking with. It wasn't something that he regularly did, especially when I would go over to give him information. So I was a bit taken aback, but I didn't think much of it, and thinking that I would be able to have the conversation with him a few moments later.
And were you able to have that conversation a few moments later?
Probably about 20 to 25 minutes later. There was another period in between where he shut the door again, and then when he finally got out of the vehicle, we had the conversation. But at that point, there was a backlog of information that he should have been made aware of.
And so you opened the door to the control car, and Mr. Meadows pulled it shut?
That's correct.
And he did that 2 times?
That's correct.
And when you finally were able to give Mr. Meadows the information about the violence at the Capitol, what was his reaction?
He almost had a lack of reaction. I remember him saying, all right, something to the effect of, how much longer does the president have left in his speech?
Again, much of this information about the potential for violence was known or learned before the onset of the violence, early enough for President Trump to take steps to prevent it. He could, for example, have urged the crowd at the ellipse not to march to the Capitol. He could have condemned the violence immediately once it began, or he could have taken multiple other steps. But as we will see today and in later hearings, President Trump had something else in mind. One other question at this point, Ms. Hutchinson, were you aware of concerns that White House counsel Pat Cipollone or Eric Hirschman had about the language President Trump used in his ellipse speech?
There were many discussions the morning of the 6th about the rhetoric of the speech that day. In my conversations with Mr. Hirschman, he had relayed that we would be foolish to include language that had been included at the president's request, which had lines along to the effect of, fight for Trump, we're going to march to the Capitol, I'll be there with you, fight for me, fight for what we're doing, fight for the movement. Things about the vice president at the time, too. Both Mr. Hirschman and White House counsel's office were urging the speechwriters to not include that language for legal concerns and also for the optics of what it could portray the president wanting to do that day.
And we just heard the president say that he would be with his supporters as they marched to the Capitol. Even though he did not end up going, he certainly wanted to. Some have questioned whether President Trump genuinely planned to come here to the Capitol on January 6th. In his book, Mark Meadows falsely wrote that after President Trump gave his speech on January 6th, he told Mr. Meadows that he was, quote, speaking metaphorically about the walk to the Capitol. As you will see, Donald Trump was not speaking metaphorically. As we heard earlier, Rudy Giuliani told Ms. Hutchinson that Mr. Trump planned to travel to the Capitol on January 6th. I want to pause for just a moment to ask you, Ms. Hutchinson, to explain some of the terminology you will hear today. We've heard you use 2 different terms to describe plans for the president's movement to the Capitol or anywhere else. One of those is a scheduled movement, and another one is OTR. Could you describe for us what each of those mean?
A scheduled presidential movement is on his official schedule. It's notified to the press and to a wide range of staff that will be traveling with him. It's known to the public, known to the Secret Service, and they're able to coordinate the movement days in advance. An off-the-record movement is confined to the knowledge of a very, very small group of advisors and staff. Typically, a very small group of staff would travel with him, mostly that are just included in the national security package. You can pull an off-the-record movement together in less than an hour. It's a way to kind of circumvent having to release it to the press, if that's the goal of it, or to not have to have as many security parameters put in place ahead of time to make the movement happen.
Thank you. And let's turn back now to the president's plans to travel to the Capitol on January 6th. We know that White House counsel Pat Cipollone was concerned about the legal implications of such a trip, and he agreed with the Secret Service that it shouldn't happen. Ms. Hutchinson, did you have any conversations with Pat Cipollone about his concerns about the president going to the Capitol on January 6th?
On January 3rd, Mr. Cipollone had approached me, knowing that Mark had raised the prospect of going up to the Capitol on January 6th. Mr. Cipollone and I had a brief private conversation where he said to me, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. This would be legally a terrible idea for us. We have serious legal concerns if we go up to the Capitol that day. And he then urged me to continue relaying that to Mr. Meadows, because it's my understanding that Mr. Cipollone thought that Mr. Meadows was indeed pushing this along with the president.
And we understand, Ms. Hutchinson, that you also spoke to Mr. Cipollone on the morning of the 6th as you were about to go to the rally on the Ellipse. And Mr. Cipollone said something to you like, make sure the movement to the Capitol does not happen. Is that correct?
That's correct. I saw Mr. Cipollone right before I walked out onto West Exec that morning, and Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. We're going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we make that movement happen.
And do you remember which crimes Mr. Cipollone was concerned with?
In the days leading up to the 6th, we had conversations about potentially obstructing justice or defrauding the electoral count.
Let's hear about some of those concerns that you mentioned earlier in one of your interviews with us.
Having a private conversation with Pat late in the afternoon of the 3rd or the 4th, that Pat was concerned it would look like we were obstructing justice or obstructing the electoral college count. And I apologize for probably not being very firm with my legal terms here, but that it would look like we were obstructing what was happening on Capitol Hill. And he was also worried that it would look like we were inciting a riot or encouraging a riot to erupt on the Capitol, at the Capitol.
In fact, in the days before January 6th and on January 6th itself, President Trump expressed to multiple White House aides that he wanted to go to the Capitol after his speech. Here's what various White House aides have told the committee about the president's desire to go to the Capitol.
Did the president tell you this, that he wanted to speak at the Capitol?
Correct, yes.
During the meeting in the dining room, did the idea of the president proceeding or walking to the Capitol on the 6th after his speech come up?
Walking to the Capitol? No.
Driving to the Capitol?
It came up.
Okay, how did it come up and what was discussed?
He brought it up. He said, I want to go down to the Capitol.
What about him marching to the Capitol on the 6th?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So, it's kind of a general thing. I mean, to get into the specifics of it, I was aware of the desire of the president to potentially march to the or accompany the rally attendees to the Capitol.
When did you first hear about this idea of the president accompanying rally attendees to the Capitol on the 6th?
Well, this was at the 6th. This was during the after he finished his remarks.
When the president said that he would be going to the Capitol during his speech on the Ellipse, the Secret Service scrambled to find a way for him to go. We know this from witnesses and the Secret Service, also from messages among staff on the President's National Security Council. The NSC staff were monitoring the situation in real time, and you can see how the situation evolved in the following chat log that the committee has obtained. As you can see, NSC staff believed that 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥, the president, was, quote, going to the Capitol, and, quote, they are finding the best route now. From these chats, we also know the staff learned of the attack on the Capitol in real time. When President Trump left the ellipse stage at 1:10, the staff knew that rioters had invaded the inaugural stage and Capitol Police were calling for all available officers to respond. When Republican leader Kevin McCarthy heard the president say he was going to the Capitol, he called you, Ms. Hutchinson. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And in this text message, you told Tony Ornato, quote, "McCarthy just called me too. And do you guys think you're coming to my office?" Tell us about the call that day with Leader McCarthy during the president's speech on the ellipse.
I was still in the tent behind the stage, and when you're behind the stage, you can't really hear what's going on in front of you. So when Mr. McCarthy called me with this information, I answered the call and he sounded rushed, but also frustrated and angry at me. And I was confused because I didn't know what the president had just said. He then explained, the president just said he's marching to the Capitol. You told me this whole week you aren't coming up here. Why would you lie to me? I said, I'm not lying. I wasn't lying to you, sir. We're not going to the Capitol. And he said, well, he just said it on stage, Cassidy. Figure it out. Don't come up here. I said, I'll run the traps on this and I'll shoot you a text. I can assure you we're not coming up to the Capitol. We've already made that decision. He pressed a little bit more, believing me, but I think frustrated that the president had said that. And we ended the phone conversation after that. I called Mr. Ornato to reconfirm that we weren't going to the Capitol, and which is also in our text messages. I sent Mr. McCarthy another text telling him the affirmative that we were not going up to the Capitol, and he didn't respond after that.
And we understand, Ms. Hutchinson, that the plans for the president to come up to the Capitol had included discussions at some point about what the president would do when he came up to the Capitol on January 6th. Let's look at a clip of one of your interviews discussing that issue with the committee.
When you were talking about a scheduled movement, did anyone say what the president wanted to do when he got here?
No. Not that I can specifically remember. I remember hearing a few different ideas discussed between Mark and Scott Perry, Mark and Rudy Giuliani. I don't know which conversations were elevated to the president. I don't know what he personally wanted to do when he went up to the Capitol that day. I know that there were discussions about him having another speech outside of the Capitol before going in. I know that there was a conversation about him going into the House chamber at one point.
As we've all just heard, in the days leading up to January 6th, on the day of the speech, both before and during and after the rally speech, President Trump was pushing his staff to arrange for him to come up here to the Capitol during the electoral vote count. Let's turn now to what happened in the president's vehicle when the Secret Service told him he would not be going. Here's the president's motorcade leaving the ellipse after his speech on January 6th. Returned to the White House in the motorcade after the president's speech. Where did you go?
When I returned to the White House, I walked upstairs towards the Chief of Staff's office, and I noticed Mr. Ornato lingering outside of the office. And once we had made eye contact, he quickly waved me to go into his office, which was just across the hall. Bobby Engel, who is the head of Mr. Trump's security detail, sitting in a chair, just looking somewhat discombobulated and a little lost. And I looked at Tony, and he had said, did you effing hear what happened in the Beast? I said, no, Tony, I just got back. He proceeded to tell me that when the president got in the Beast, he was under the impression from Mr. Meadows that the off-the-record movement to the Capitol was still possible and likely to happen, but that Bobby had more information. So once the president had gotten into the vehicle, and when Bobby had relayed to him, we don't have the assets to do it, it's not secure, we're going back to the West Wing, the president had very strong, a very angry response to that. Tony described him as being irate. Take me up to the Capitol now. To which Bobby responded, sir, we have to go back to the West Wing. The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 grabbed his arm. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol.
Holy shit.
Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥. And when Mr. Ornato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
And was Mr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 in the room as Mr. Ornato told you this story?
He was.
Were you with any part of this story from Mr. Ornato?
Mr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 did not correct or disagree with any part of the story.
Did Mr. 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐥 or Mr. Ornato ever after that tell you that what Mr. Ornato had just said was untrue?
Neither Mr. Ornato nor
And despite this altercation, this physical altercation, during the ride back to the White House, President Trump still demanded to go to the Capitol. Here's what the secretary at the time wrote in her personal notes and told the committee about President Trump's desire to go to the Capitol after returning to the White House.
When you wrote, POTUS wanted to walk to the Capitol, speech or anything that he or anybody else said afterwards?
So to the best, back to the White House, he said he wanted to physically walk with, he'd be fine with just riding the Beast, but to the best of my recollection, he wanted to be a part of the march in some fashion.
Okay, and just for the record, the Beast refers to the presidential limousine?
Yes.
President Trump did not go to the Capitol that day. We understand that he blamed.
So prior to leaving the rally site, when he got off the stage and everybody was making the movement back to the motorcade, I had overheard Mr. Meadows say to him then, as I had prior to Mr. Trump taking the stage that morning, that he was to the Capitol. So when Mr. Trump took the stage, he was under the impression via Mr. Meadows that it was still possible. So when he got off the stage, I had relayed to Mr. Meadows that I had another conversation with Tony. The movement was still not. As they proceeded to go to the motorcade, and Mr. Meadows had reiterated, we're going to work on it, sir, talk to Bobby. Bobby has more information. Mark got into his vehicle. To my understanding, Trump got into the Beast, and after we had all arrived back at the me via Mark that the president wasn't happy that Bobby didn't pull it off for him and that Mark didn't work hard enough to get the movement on the books.
The physical altercation that Ms. Hutchinson described in the presidential vehicle was not the first time that the president had become very angry about issues relating to the election. On December 1, 2020, Attorney General Barr said in an interview that the Department of Justice had not found evidence of widespread election fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election. Ms. Hutchinson, How did the president react to hearing that news?
Around the time that I understand the AP article went live, I remember hearing noise coming from down the hallway, so I poked my head out of the office, and I saw the valet walking towards our office. He had said, "Get the chief down to the dining room, the president wants him." So Mark went down to the dining room and came back to the office a few minutes later. After Mark had returned, I left the office and went down to the dining room, and I noticed that the door was propped open and the valet was inside the dining room changing the tablecloth off of the dining room table. He motioned for me to come in and then pointed towards the front of the room near the fireplace mantle and the TV, where I first noticed there was ketchup dripping down the wall and there's a shattered porcelain plate on the floor. The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall, which was causing them to have to clean up. So I grabbed a towel and started wiping the ketchup off of the wall to help the valet out. And he said something to the effect of, he's really ticked off about this. I would stay clear of him for right now. He's really, really ticked off about this right now.
And Ms. Hutchinson, was this the only instance that you are aware of where the president threw dishes?
It's not.
And are there other instances in the dining room that you recall where he expressed his anger?
There were several times throughout my tenure with the Chief of Staff that I was aware of him either throwing dishes or flipping the tablecloth to let all the contents of the table go onto the floor and likely break or go everywhere.
And Ms. Hutchinson, Attorney General Barr described to the committee the president's angry reaction when he finally met with President Trump. Let's listen.
And I said, look, I know that you're dissatisfied with me, and I'm glad to offer my resignation. And he pounded the table very hard. Everyone sort of jumped, and he said, accept it.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. The chair requests those in the hearing room to remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted our witness from the room. Pursuant to the order of the committee of today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
All right, so they are now in recess. We're going to talk about what we've just heard. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷 has now joined us. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐷, how you doing?
Okay. Warm, toasty, and hauling a really wide load.
I don't think I'm going to comment on that. All right, in case you're just joining us, honestly, in some ways, I was expecting more. I was expecting them to be going after Mark Meadows on this. I think there's certainly already significant evidence of potential criminal behavior against him. That's what I've been expecting when she was called. This more seemed to be talking about what Trump was saying and doing on the 6th, including but not limited to saying that he wanted the security removed. He wanted the metal detectors removed. He wanted everybody permitted, even if they were armed and had body armor. He wanted all of them permitted at the march, and then all of them permitted to go to the Capitol building, which he had already been informed there were multiple breaches. And he said that he wanted everybody there, and he wanted to go there when he was told that they would not, mainly to protect him, and because they had been made aware that there was potentially some criminal liability if he went, because it could be seen as inciting to riot, and it could be seen as attempting to interfere with the election. He actually tried to grab the wheel from his Secret Service driver and tried to... I mean, this is the behavior of a petulant child, which is reasonably common for this man. This isn't as shocking as you'd think. And then when they tried to pry him off the wheel of the, really grabbing the wheel while the guy's driving. Okay. Trump is blocked at 12 years old. I've said this before. I'll say it again. He's a 12-year-old emotionally. At any rate, and then when the Secret Service tried to pry him off, apparently he went for the throat of the Secret Serviceman. He also apparently threw up his lunch or his meal, whatever it was, at the wall. We've heard a few objections about how much of this is hearsay, how the ketchup and how they got on the wall and how the plates were broken is hearsay. The fact that they was not hearsay because it was a witness to it, and she is reporting. She asked, how did this happen, and got a report as to how this happened. At any rate, that's what we're looking at. Is Andring, welcome. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, to the ardent Trump supporter, it's just a matter of Jesus take the wheel, and they probably would have been happy if he'd done so.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think one problem is, you had said this before, and I think you're right. I think we need to do this much more often, which is do not attribute to malice that which can be reasonably explained by stupidity and or incompetence. Or incompetence. A lot of times when Trump says, we have to fight for our rights, and he's talking to an armed crowd, it's like, well, no pun intended, there's no smoking gun. He's not saying let's go out there and commit a violent insurrection. But on the flip side, it's like, okay, what's reasonable to expect here? Is he just being a complete blathering idiot, which tends to be my go-to position on Trump? Is he being a complete blathering idiot and doesn't really understand the consequences of what he's saying to whom he's saying it? Or is he trying to be the mob boss? It's like, that's a nice electoral college you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. So you've been watching this. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, and, the terms like, go fight like hell, I mean, that is so commonplace in political discourse. It's like, just because I don't care who you're talking to, going say, we need to fight like hell to win this election. That is so commonplace. Every political leader says things along those same lines. At this point, I don't think you can infer anything was intended other than don't give up. Of course, it's hard to prove either way because you don't know what's going on in somebody's mind. But that's such a common statement over the past 20 years that you can't just attribute that. He meant for them to go and an armed insurrection at the Capitol and go take everybody or take everything over. It's like you cannot infer that. I'm not quite such a big fan of all of the hearsay testimony that they've been giving. It's like I'm not real particularly interested in hearsay. It's like, let's get some corroborating actual witnesses that were there before you just start trotting out a bunch of hearsay. Especially when it's about such personal attacks towards Donald Trump. And I don't like the guy at all. And I could actually picture him doing all of the things that they described, just based off of all of his other actions, the way he just acts. In something like this, I think that it's beneath them to be presenting so much hearsay from witnesses. I
think the problem is most of the primary witnesses have either refused to testify or pleaded the fifth and or are fighting subpoenas, which I think they're presenting the best that they've got outside of that. The other thing, I do want to offer some pushback on one point, and this is why they had to establish this first. This is why we had to go through some of the really boring shit first, which is, I think you're right about the rhetoric, but there's one kind of caveat here, which is at this point, he knows he's lost the election. He's been told by everybody he's lost the election. So when he says fight for it, what does he mean? What can he possibly mean? The election is over. He's been told that Mike Pence does not have the authority to overturn the election. He's been told, and he is now sending these fake electors. When he's talking to an armed crowd, and every member of his Justice Department except for one, which they've talked about, And this guy was not qualified, clearly not qualified, and Trump glommed onto him because he was just the only one willing to tell him what he wanted to hear. So when every single member of his own Justice Department is telling him that he's lost, that there was no fraud, when every state has certified the election and said there was no fraud, when he's been told that there is nothing he can do, the election is over, and he's lost. If he's talking to an armed crowd that he knows is armed, he's already tried, and that was the other testimony here that you may have missed. He told them to let everybody in, even the people in body armor and with the AR-15s. Let all of them through. And he tells this crowd to fight like hell for him. What could he possibly mean?
Well, this is Trump's mind. This meant 2 different things. I don't even particularly think that the man's particularly competent. But I mean, it's still pretty standard rhetoric. I mean, I think that it's just a bit of a step too far to say that he intended or that he was trying to tell everybody, take your guns down there and shoot everyone up. It's like we don't have access to his mind. That could be what he intended, but I think that it's more likely that he was wanting them to raise a hell of a ruckus at the very least and bring social pressure against everybody to try and keep fighting. I actually won. He knows it's not true, or at least he should have known that that's not true, but he refused to accept it, and so he kept telling everybody you still need to go out and fight for this election. I think that he genuinely believed, from all of the testimony and all of his actions, I think that he had genuinely convinced himself that he could still win this, and that there really was election fraud, and that if he could just raise enough of a stink, if his supporters could raise enough of a stink, that he would eventually end up winning somehow. I said I don't quite understand how that man's mind works. I mean, it's pretty clear when you have all of these people telling you all of these things, and you have pretty much 2 options. You either delude yourself into believing that they're just wrong, and that those wild rumors of impropriety or fraud are actually true because that's what you want to believe, or you're nefarious.
But keep in mind,
like, I realize that I actually lost. I know that they're telling the truth, and now I'm just going to do everything in my power. And of course, that's what these hearings are about: is which one of these 2 things is true.
So, but
and
remember,
I have a feeling it's probably a bit of a both.
I think that's reasonably fair, but I'd like to also add that we also know that, and I'd gone back and heard exactly what the claim was that he had said when told that they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" and that they had erected a gallows and that they thought that they should move on that. He said, well, maybe, now I've forgotten the exact phrase, but maybe he deserves it. We also know that he refused to act once it was irrefutable that it had become violent and that they had breached the Capitol. He not only refused to act, but was gleeful and thrilled by it. So it seems to me, while I don't think, I mean, this isn't a hearing. Sorry, this is a hearing. This is not a trial. But it seems to me to be quite easily more likely than not. So at least at a civil level, that he knew what he was doing. And when you take a look at how seriously he wanted to be there, it strikes me that by this point there's easily sufficient evidence to say, at least more likely than not, certainly at least the minimum bar for actually bringing criminal charges against somebody is that there is at least the possibility of victory. So that's sort of the lowest bar, then beyond a preponderance, which is the civil level, and then beyond a reasonable doubt. I agree with you. I don't think they would, at least on that particular charge. I think on other charges, they've hurled past a reasonable doubt. That includes what happened in Georgia. That includes what happened with the Secretary of State. In regards to deliberately inciting the mob, I don't think they've passed beyond a reasonable doubt. I think there are reasonable ways to say maybe not. So, and I think you've got a very good point there. But I think they've hurled past at least beyond a preponderance. Would you?
I think they have a preponderance of evidence showing that I hate to say, I'm still not entirely convinced that he went out there with the intent to gin up a violent mob to go, attack the Capitol. I think that when it started happening, that he was clearly pleased by it. He didn't bother him in the least that they were doing that. He was probably pretty pissed off at Pence. So, I don't put a whole lot of stock into the utterances of, well, perhaps he deserves it. Because you can say things like that all the time and not actually mean them. I mean, I think at some point we've all mentioned something dreadful about somebody else that were it to actually happen, we would be like, oh, yeah, I didn't really mean for you to go do that. I was just venting.
Yeah.
But here's the big thing for me, which I guess nullifies everything that I just said. Because he ought to have known. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that he should have known darn well and good what was likely to occur. And I think that is sufficient to bring charges on because, it doesn't matter if you're freaking incompetent, you're negligent. It's something that you should have known. Everybody, well, not everybody, a large number of people were telling you this. It's like you have no defense to hide behind saying, well, I didn't know. You should have known.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing for me. It's like, whether he actually intended it or not, he should have freaking known what his actions could do. He should have known. And that's all you have to show in court is that he should have been clearly aware of this. Whether he actually was or not doesn't particularly matter. Because he's either guilty, culpable, or he's negligent, in which case he's still culpable. So
I think you bring up a great point there, too, because I do think, it was one of the things I've always said was I never thought he was qualified in any. I mean, I remember when he, gave away the location of the nuclear football to a 12-year-old kid, and I'm sitting there going, you don't talk to a 12-year-old kid bragging about there's all the launch codes, and that's how I can end the world. I'm sitting there going, he's just not qualified, and the problem is when you willingly accept a position of power, you are tacitly saying that you're qualified for it. And if it turns out you're not qualified, you're the one who has to take the responsibility for whatever happens as a result of your failure to be qualified for what you said you could and would do. He assumed the responsibility of being president. So, I think you've got a great point. Okay, let's see what they're saying now.
As a gentlewoman from Wyoming, Vice Chair Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we turn to what Ms. Hutchinson saw and heard in the White House during the violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th, let's discuss certain communications White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows had on January 5th.
This is what I've been
President Trump's associate, Roger Stone, attended rallies during the afternoon and the evening of January 5th in Washington, D.C. On January 5th and 6th, Mr. Stone was photographed with multiple members of the Oath Keepers, who were allegedly serving as his security detail. As we now know, multiple members of that organization have been charged with or pled guilty to crimes associated with January 6th. Mr. Stone has invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination before this committee. General Michael Flynn has also taken the fifth before this committee.
It's not a privilege, it's a right. But
Mr. Stone previously had been convicted of other federal crimes unrelated to January 6th. General Flynn had pleaded guilty to a felony charge also predating and unrelated to January 6th. President Trump pardoned General Flynn just weeks after the presidential election. And in July of 2020, he commuted the sentence Roger Stone was to serve. The night before January 6th, President Trump instructed his Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, to contact both Roger Stone and Michael Flynn regarding what would play out the next day. Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that President Trump asked Mark Meadows to speak with Roger Stone and General Flynn on January 5th?
That's correct. That is my understanding.
And Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that Mr. Meadows called Mr. Stone on the 5th?
I'm under the impression that Mr. Meadows did complete both a call to Mr. Stone and General Flynn the evening of the 5th.
And do you know what they talked about that evening, Ms. Hutchinson?
I'm not sure.
Is it your understanding that Mr. Giuliani, Mr. Eastman, and others had set up what has been called, quote, a war room at the Willard Hotel on the night of the 5th?
I was aware of that the night of the 5th.
And do you know if Mr. Meadows ever intended to go to the Willard Hotel on the night of the 5th?
Mr. Meadows had...
Just to be crystal clear on something, a war room is common terminology. That's something every party has a, quote, war room whenever there's any kind of campaign. So war room is nothing. You can't draw anything from that terminology. Just that's what we're discussing. Calling it a war room is absolutely meaningless.
Had a conversation with me where he wanted me to work with Secret Service on a movement from the White House to the Willard Hotel so he could attend the meeting or meetings with Mr. Giuliani and his associates in the war room.
And what was your view as to whether or not Mr. Meadows should go to the Willard that night?
I had made it clear to Mr. Meadows that I didn't believe it was a smart idea for him to go to the Willard Hotel that night. I wasn't sure everything that was going on at the Willard Hotel, although I knew enough about what Mr. Giuliani and his associates were pushing during this period. I didn't think that it was something appropriate for the White House Chief of Staff to attend or to consider involvement in. I made that clear to Mr. Meadows. Throughout the afternoon, he mentioned a few more times going up to the Willard Hotel that evening, and then eventually dropped the subject the night of the 5th and said that he would dial in instead.
So General Flynn has appeared before this committee, and when he appeared before our committee, he took the 5th. Let's briefly view a clip of General Mike Flynn taking the 5th Amendment. General Flynn, do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified?
Do we have a minute?
Yes.
That is pure propaganda, and I'm a little annoyed that they would show that.
All right, we're back. Congressman Cheney, could you repeat your question, please?
Yes. General Flynn, do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified?
Can I get a clarification? Is that a moral question or are you asking a legal question?
I'm asking both.
I think what she's asking is there any justification for that violence? And if so, what is it?
Do you believe the violence on January 6th was justified morally?
Take the 5th.
You believe the violence on January 6th was justified legally?
5th.
General Flynn, do you believe in the peaceful transition of power in the United States of America?
So he says, oh my God. Wow.
Let's move on now to January 6th and the conduct of Donald Trump and Mark Meadows during the attack on the Capitol. Ms. Hutchinson, I'd like now for us to listen to a description, your description of what transpired in the West Wing during the attack. For context, in this clip, you described the time frame starting at about 2 p.m.
It's clear she didn't want to get into it with him, but it's like, it was a moral question. The 5th only applies against self-incrimination. How is answering a question of morality going to be self-incrimination? Oh my God. Oh, and then do you believe in the peaceful transfer of power? The 5th is like
answer?
The 5th.
Okay. So he bled the 5th for that too.
On that one too, which so if this were a court, you couldn't take it either way. I'm inclined to try to uphold the same values as what would happen in a court because we have them for a reason. Just because we're not in a court doesn't mean, but you have to recognize we're not. But nonetheless, it's like the answer to that is either yes or no. If the answer is no, if I were him, I wouldn't want to say it. It still isn't going to, I think, well, no, that probably would be incriminating. I believed for him the answer would have to be yes.
Yeah,
everybody, everybody who's been asked that question so far has said, yes, I believe in the peaceful transition. It's just that this was fraud, right? But he wouldn't even say that, which was a little odd. Why wouldn't you just say, of course I believe in peaceful transition. I just, I just think that there was fraud here and we have to deal with it. It was odd that he'd plead the fifth even for that, because I do think his answer would have been yes. So it's like, why wouldn't he say yes? I'm thrown by that one. Anyways, what were you going to say?
Well, I guess to play the devil's advocate on this one is, if I were in his position, I would think that they're trying to set up some sort of case to prove some sort of mindset of his, some sort of intent behind it, and therefore I would not answer any of those questions at all, because they could be used to try and say, well, here's your state of mind, to try and show what your state of mind is, regardless of what your answer is. So, even if you said, well, of course I believe in the peaceful transfer of power, all of these answers can be used to build up, to show, hey, this is kind of your mindset. This is what he was thinking about, and that can be used in a court of law to do that. So even asking questions on morality, you absolutely can plead the fifth for that, because, they're clearly trying to set up, when they ask you questions like that, they're trying to set up some sort of, pattern or some sort of history to kinds of answers. So
fair. I think it's fair. It's a little shocking, but I think you're right. And if I were his lawyer, I'd have said, you know what? No, I don't care if they ask you what your name is. Plead the fifth. All right. I do want to make two quick points. We do have a hard stop time coming up. It's in a little more than an hour. My hope is we'll be able to get all the way through this. Depends on how long they last, but we'll talk about that as we get closer. Join us on the Discord if you want to see more about what we're doing to cover this. We do a lot of other stuff, but this is obviously very much in our wheelhouse and the kind of thing we do. So we're going to cover all of the hearings. We also have coming up, as I said tonight, the microbiology and nanobots discussion tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow, we're going to discuss what's happening with Roe v. Wade state by state, because now we have to. So a lot going on. I'm going to resume this, but join us on the Discord. Titan dropped that just a minute or two ago. And, we're actually community sourced. A lot of people contribute to this. You can help contribute or just watch, partake in the discussions. We'd love to have you, and you can learn more about what we do here and learn more about the January 6th committee hearing. So let's get back to this.
So I remember Mark being alone in his office for quite some time, and I know we've spoken about Ben.
Oh, sorry, I forgot one other thing I was going to mention. We had a correction, and I think it's worth it. I had pointed out that the use of the Fifth Amendment is a right, not a privilege. And I pointed that out because I want to try to be clear when I think that they're doing a little showboating too. And it's like, oh, well, it was a privilege of, and I was just like, nah, it's a right. So let's be fair. But Brooks pointed out that it's in the use it's referred to as the privilege. So I was in error there. And since it was actually worth pointing out, if I had been correct, it's also worth pointing out when I was wrong. So thank you for the correction.
Williamson going in at one point, and I don't personally remember Ben going in. I don't doubt that he had gone in, but I remember him being alone in his office for most of the afternoon, around 2 o'clock to 2:05. Around 2 o'clock to 2:05, we were watching the TV, and I could see that the rioters were getting closer and closer to the Capitol. Mark still hadn't popped out of his office or said anything about it, so that's when I went into his office. I saw that he was sitting on his couch on his cell phone, same as the morning where he was just kind of scrolling and typing. I said, hey, are you watching the TV, Chief? Because his TV was small. You can see it, but I didn't know if he was really paying attention. I said, you watching the TV, Chief? He was like, yeah. The rioters are getting really close. Have you talked to the president? He said, no, he wants to be alone right now. Still looking at his phone. So I started to get frustrated because I sort of felt like I was watching this is not a great comparison, but a bad car accident that was about to happen where you can't stop it, but you want to be able to do something. And I remember thinking in that moment, Mark needs to snap out of this, and I don't know how to snap him out of this, and he needs to care. And I just remember I blurted out, I said, Mark, do you know where Jim's at right now? And he looked up at me at that point and said, Jim? And I said, Mark, he was on the floor a little while ago giving a floor speech. Did you listen? He said, yeah, it was really good. Did you like it? And I said, yeah. Do you know where he's at right now? He said, no, I haven't heard from him. And I said, you might want to check in with him, Mark. And I remember pointing at the TV, and I said, the rioters are getting close. They might get in. And he looked at me and said something to the effect of, all right, I'll give him a call.
Not long after the rioters broke into the Capitol, you described what happened with White House counsel Pat Cipollone.
No more than a minute and a half later, I see Pat Cipollone barreling down the hallway towards our office. And rushed right in, looked at me, said, is Mark in his office? And I said, yes. He just looked at me and started shaking his head and went over, opened Mark's office door, stood there with the door propped open, and said something to Mark is still sitting on his phone. I remember glancing and he's still sitting on his phone. And I remember Pat saying to him something to the effect of, the rioters have gotten to the Capitol, Mark. We need to go down and see the president now. And Mark looked up at it and said, he doesn't want to do anything, Pat. And Pat said something to the effect of, and very clearly had said this to Mark, something to the effect of, Mark, something needs to be done or people are going to die and the blood's going to be on your effing hands. This is getting out of control. I'm going down there. And at that point, Mark stood up from his couch, both of his phones in his hand, he had his glasses on still. He walked out with Pat. He put both of his phones on my desk and said, let me know if Jim calls. And they walked out and went down to the dining room.
A few minutes later, Representative Jordan called back.
A couple minutes later, so likely around between 2:15 and 2:25. I know the tweet went out at 2:24. I don't remember if I was there when the tweet went out or if it happened right afterwards, but Jim had called. I answered the phone, said 1 second. He knew it was, I guess he knew it was, and I introduced myself, but I don't remember if he called my cell phone or if he had called one of Mark's. But I answered the phone and said, 1 second, Mark's on the hall, I'm going to go hand the phone to him. He said, okay. So I went down, I asked the valet if Mark was in the dining room. Valet said yes. I opened the door to the dining room, briefly stepped in to get Mark's attention, showed him the phone, like flipped the phone his way so he could see it said Jim Jordan. He had stepped to where I was standing there holding the door open, took the phone talking to Jim with the door still propped open. So I took a few steps back. So I probably was 2 feet from Mark. He was standing in the doorway going to the Oval Office dining room. They had a brief conversation, and in the crossfires, I heard briefly like what they were talking about, but in the background, I had heard conversations in the Oval dining room at that point talking about the hang Mike Pence chants.
That clip ended with
All right. Apologies for the interruption. We switched to subscribe mode. Thank you, Humanist Swede. That was a good call. We've switched to subscribe mode. I do apologize. That means you now need to be a subscriber. It's free. Just hit the subscribe button, but you need to be a subscriber to speak. There is no time limit on it, so you could have been a subscriber for 10 seconds. It doesn't matter, but you do need to be a subscriber to speak. That will eliminate the bots. That was a good call. Thank you.
Ms. Hutchinson, with you recalling that you heard the President, Mr. Meadows, and the White House counsel discussing the hang Mike Pence chants, and then you described for us what happened next.
It wasn't until Mark hung up the phone, handed it back to me. I went back to my desk. A couple minutes later, him and Pat came back, possibly Eric Hirschman too. I'm pretty sure Eric Hirschman was there, but I'm confident it was Pat that was there. I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. To which Pat said something, this is effing crazy. We need to be doing something more. Briefly stepped into Mark's office. And when Mark had said something, said something to the effect of, he doesn't think they're doing anything wrong, knowing what I had heard briefly in the dining room, coupled with Pat discussing the hang Mike Pence chants in the lobby of our office, and then Mark's response, I understood there to be the rioters in the Capitol that were chanting for the vice president to be hung.
Let me pause here on this point. As rioters chanted hang Mike Pence, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, said that, quote, Mike deserves it, and that those rioters were not doing anything wrong. This is a sentiment that he has expressed at other times as well. In an interview with ABC News correspondent Jonathan Karl, President Trump was asked about the supporters chanting "Hang Mike Pence" last year. Instead of condemning them, the former president defended them.
Because it's common sense, John. It's common sense that you're supposed to protect. How can you, if you know a vote is fraudulent, right? How can you pass on a fraudulent vote to Congress?
President Trump's view that the rioters were not doing anything wrong and that, quote, Mike deserved it, helps us to understand why the president did not ask the rioters to leave the Capitol for multiple hours. In fact, he put this tweet out at 2:24 p.m. Ms. Hutchinson, do you recall seeing this tweet in which the president said the vice president did not have the courage to do what needed to be done?
I do.
And Ms. Hutchinson, what was your reaction when you saw this tweet?
As a staffer that works to always represent the administration to the best of my ability and to showcase the good things that he had done for the country, I remember feeling frustrated, disappointed, and really, it felt personal. I was really sad. As an American, I was disgusted. It was unpatriotic. It was un-American. We were watching the Capitol building get defaced over a lie. And it was something that was really hard in that moment to digest, knowing what I had been hearing down the hall in the conversations that were happening, seeing that tweet come up and knowing what was happening on the Hill. And it's something that I still struggle to work through the emotions of that.
Ms. Hutchinson, we have also spoken to multiple other White House staff about their reaction to Donald Trump's 224 tweet, condemning Mike Pence for not having the courage to refuse to count electoral votes, an act that would have been illegal. Matthew Pottinger, a former Marine intelligence officer who served in the White House for 4 years, including as Deputy National Security Advisor, was in the vicinity of the Oval Office at various points throughout the day. When he saw that tweet, he immediately decided to resign his position. Let's watch him describe his reaction to the president's tweet.
One of my staff brought me a printout of a tweet by the president. And the tweet said something to the effect that Mike Pence, the vice president, didn't have the courage to do what should have been done. I read that tweet and made a decision at that moment to resign. That's where I knew that I was leaving that day, once I read that tweet.
Ultimately, members of the White House staff, Sarah Matthews, cabinet members Secretary Chao and Secretary DeVos resigned as well. Here is Secretary DeVos's resignation letter. As you can see, in resigning on January 6th, Secretary DeVos said to the president, quote, "There's no mistaking the impact your rhetoric had on the situation, and it is the inflection point for me." Let's also look at Secretary Chao's resignation statement. When Secretary Chao resigned, she spoke of the January 6th attack, and she said, quote, "As I am sure is the case with many of you, this has deeply troubled me in a way I simply cannot set aside." Ms. Hutchinson, in our prior interviews, we've asked you about what the president's advisors were urging him to do during the attack. You've described roughly 3 different camps of thought inside the White House that day. Can you tell us about those?
There was a group of individuals that were strongly urging him to take immediate and swift action. I would classify the White House counsel's office, Mr. Hirschman, Ms. Ivanka Trump, in that category of really working to get him to take action and pleading with him to take action. There was a more neutral group where advisors were trying to toe the line, knowing that Mr. Trump didn't necessarily want to take immediate action and condemn the riots, but knowing something needed to be done. And then there was the last group, which was deflect and blame. Let's blame Antifa. These aren't our people. It's my understanding that Mr. Meadows was in the deflect and blame category, but he did end up taking a more neutral route, knowing that there were several advisors in the president's circle urging him to take more action, which I think was reflected in the rhetoric released later that day in the videos.
You told us that the White House counsel's office was in the camp encouraging the president to tell the rioters to stop the attack and to leave the Capitol. Let's listen.
White House counsel's office wanted there to be a strong statement out to condemn the rioters. I'm confident in that.
Now let's look at just one example of what some senior advisors to the president were urging. Ms. Hutchinson.
All right, just as a FYI, we have now received our first warning. Probably another warning or two, and the stream may go down. If the stream goes down, as a reminder, we do have the live chat will continue to function. You can continue to chat. It will continue to be broadcast into the stream. And when we're brought back up, this stream will continue to exist in its entirety here on In Time. We are also simulcasting it in case we had this problem with YouTube. The mods have the link to the simulcast, and it is also in the description, and it is pinned to the top. So if we go down, you'll be continue to be able to watch In Time's coverage, just not on YouTube. We will otherwise be continuing the stream. The chat will continue on YouTube, but the stream itself will be on the link that we have. So we're going to continue as long as we can, but we have received our first warning.
Hutchinson, could you look at the exhibit that we're showing on the screen now? Have you seen this note before?
That's a note that I wrote at the direction of the Chief of Staff on January 6th, likely around 3 o'clock.
And it's written on a Chief of Staff note card, but that's your handwriting, Ms. Hutchinson?
That's my handwriting.
And why did you write this note?
The Chief of Staff was in a meeting with Eric Hirschman, potentially Mr. Philbin, and they had rushed out of the office fairly quickly. Mark had handed me the note card with one of his pens and started dictating a statement for the president to potentially put out.
And no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. There were two phrases on there, one illegal and then one without proper authority. The illegal phrase was the one that Mr. Meadows had dictated to me. Mr. Hirschman had chimed in and said, also put without legal authority. There should have been a slash between the two phrases. It was an or if the president had opted to put one of those statements out. Evidently he didn't. Later that afternoon, Mark came back from the Oval Dining Room and put the palm card on my desk with illegally crossed out, but said we didn't need to take further action on that statement.
So, to your knowledge, this statement was never issued?
It was, to my knowledge, it was never issued.
And Ms. Hutchinson, did you understand that Ivanka Trump wanted her father to send people home?
That's my understanding, yes.
Let's play a clip of you addressing that issue.
I remember her saying at various points, you know, she wanted her dad to send them home. She wanted her dad to tell them to go home peacefully, and she wanted to include language that he necessarily wasn't on board with at the time.
You will hear more about this at our later hearings, but we have evidence of many others imploring Donald Trump and Mark Meadows to take action. Here is some of that evidence, text messages sent to Mark Meadows during the attack. This is a text message at 2:32 from Laura Ingraham. Hey Mark, the president needs to tell people in the Capitol to go home. In the next message, this is hurting all of us. And then he's destroying his legacy and playing into every stereotype. We lose all credibility against the BLM Antifa crowd if things go south. The president's son, Don Jr., also urgently contacted Mark Meadows. At 2:53, he wrote, he's got to condemn this shit ASAP. The Capitol Police tweet is not enough. As you will see, these are just two of the numerous examples of Trump supporters and allies urging the president to tell his supporters to leave the Capitol. It would not have been hard for the president to simply walk down to the briefing room a few feet down the hall from the Oval Office. As Norah O'Donnell noted during an interview with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, where Leader McCarthy said he believed the attack was un-American.
I want to quickly bring in Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader. Leader McCarthy, do you condemn this violence?
I completely condemn the violence in the Capitol. What we're currently watching unfold is un-American. I'm disappointed. I'm sad. This is not what our country should look like. This is not who we are. This is not the First Amendment. This has to stop, and this has to stop now.
Leader McCarthy, the President of the United States has a briefing room steps from the Oval Office. The cameras are hot 24/7, as you know. Why hasn't he walked down and said that now?
I conveyed to the President what I think is best to do, and I'm hopeful the President will do it.
Republican House member Mike Gallagher also implored the president to call off the attack.
Mr. President, you have got to stop this. You are the only person who can call this off. Call it off. The election is over. Call it off. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than any member of Congress. It's about the United States of America, which is more important than any politician. Call it off. It's over.
Despite the fact that many people close to Donald Trump were urging him to send people home, he did not do so until later, much later. At 4:17 p.m., Donald Trump finally told the rioters to go home and that he loved them. Here's a portion of the video President Trump recorded from the White House.
We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
But as we will show in even greater detail in future hearings, Donald Trump was reluctant to put this message out, and he still could not bring himself to condemn the attack. Ms. Hutchinson has told us that too.
The one that he put out at 4:17.
I'm sure we've discussed it, and just to elaborate if I hadn't already at that point, I recall him being reluctant to film the video on the 6th. I was not involved in any of the logistics or the planning for that video. I just remember seeing the video go out and feeling a little shocked after it went out.
On the evening of January 6th and the day after, the president's family and his senior staff and others tried to encourage the president to condemn the violence and commit to the peaceful transition of power. At 3:31 p.m. on January 6th, Sean Hannity of Fox News texted Mark Meadows. Mr. Hannity said, quote, "Can he make a statement? I saw the tweet. Ask people to leave the Capitol." Later that evening, Mr. Hannity sent another text message to Mark Meadows. This time, he shared a link to a tweet. That tweet reported that President Trump's cabinet secretaries were considering invoking the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump from office. As you can see on the screen, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution creates a process for the transition of power if a president is unfit or unable to serve. The 25th Amendment has never been used to remove a president. But the committee has learned that after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, this was being discussed by members of President Trump's cabinet as a way of stripping the full power of the presidency from Donald Trump. President Trump's supporters were worried. In addition to the tweet that he sent Mark Meadows after the attack, Sean Hannity apparently spoke with President Trump and warned him about what could happen. We understand that this text message that Sean Hannity sent to Kayleigh McEnany on January 7th shows what Mr. Hannity said to the president. First, no more stolen election talk. Second, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real. Many people will quit. Ms. Hutchinson, you told us that you were hearing about discussions related to the 25th Amendment. Here's part of what you said.
Mr. Pompeo reached out to have conversations with Mr. Meadows in case he hadn't heard the discussions amongst his cabinet secretaries. And from what I understand, it was more of a, this is what I'm hearing, I want you to be aware of it, but I also think it's worth putting on your radar because you are the chief of staff, you're technically the boss of all the cabinet secretaries, and you know, if conversations progress, you should be ready to take action on this. I'm concerned for you and your positioning with this. Reach out to me if you have any questions, or like I can be helpful with you at all.
Inside the White House, the president's advisors, including members of his family, wanted him to deliver a speech to the country. Deputy White House counsel Pat Philbin prepared the first draft of what would be the president's remarks on national healing, delivered by a pre-taped video on January 7th. When he arrived at the White House on the 7th, Mr. Philbin believed that more needed to be said, so he sat down and started writing. He shared the draft with Pat Cipollone, who also believed the president needed to say more. Mr. Cipollone agreed with the content, as did Eric Hirschman, who reviewed the draft. The committee has learned that the president did not agree with the substance as drafted and resisted giving a speech at all. Ms. Hutchinson, do you recall discussions about the president's speech on January 7th?
I do.
Let's listen, Ms. Hutchinson, to what you told us about that and about the process of crafting those remarks.
I learned from a conversation with Mark and overhearing between him and White House counsel and Eric Hirschman as well that Trump didn't necessarily think he needed to do anything more on the 7th than what he had already done on the 6th. When he was convinced to put out a video on the 7th, I understand that he had a lot of opinions about what the context of that announcement were to entail. I had original drafts of the speech where there were several lines that didn't make it in there about prosecuting the rioters or calling them violent. He didn't want that in there. He wanted to put in there that he wanted to potentially pardon them. It's just with the increased emphasis of his mindset at the time, which was he didn't think they did anything wrong. The people who did something wrong that day, or the person who did something wrong that day was Mike Pence by not standing with him.
But the president's advisors urged him to give the speech.
Who convinced him to do the video on the 7th?
I'm not sure who convinced him or if it was a group of people that convinced him.
Who was in the group that you're aware of?
That I'm aware of. Mark, Ivanka, Jared Kushner, Eric Hirschman, Pat Cipollone, Pat Philbin. Those are the people that I'm aware of.
Do you know why that group of people thought it was necessary for him to release a statement?
I believe 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿 as well. From what I understood at the time, and from what the reports were coming in, there's a large concern of the 25th Amendment potentially being invoked, and there were concerns about what would happen in the Senate if the 25th was invoked. So the primary reason that I had heard, other than, we did not do enough on the 6th, we need to get a stronger message out there to condemn this, otherwise this will be your legacy. The secondary reason to that was think about what might happen in the final 15 days of your presidency if we don't do this. There's already talks about invoking the 25th Amendment. You need this as cover.
The president ultimately delivered the remarks. Unlike many of his other speeches, he did not ad-lib much. He recited them without significant alteration, except one. Even then, on January 7th, 2021, the day after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, the president still could not bring himself to say, quote, "But this election is now over." One other point about the speech, Ms. Hutchinson. Did you hear that Mr. Trump at one point wanted to add language about pardoning those who took part in the January 6th riot?
I did hear that, and I understand that Mr. Meadows was encouraging that language as well.
Thank you, and here's what you told us previously about that.
You said he was instructed not to include it. Who was instructing him not to include language about the pardon in that January 7th?
I understood from White House counsel's office coming to our office that morning that they didn't think that it was a good idea to include that in the speech.
That being Pat Cipollone?
That's correct. And Eric Hirschman.
Ms. Hutchinson, did Rudy Giuliani ever suggest that he was interested in receiving a presidential pardon related to January 6th?
He did.
Ms. Hutchinson, did White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows ever indicate that he was interested in receiving a presidential pardon related to January 6th?
Mr. Meadows did seek that pardon, yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I want to thank our witness for joining us today. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for today's witness.
Well, and keep in mind, if he pardons all of them, he's essentially saying, of course, obviously, that what they did was okay, and he's encouraging them to do it again. Utterly stunning.
And we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objections, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witness. Without objection, the chair recognizes the vice chair for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking Ms. Hutchinson for her testimony today. We are all in her debt. Our nation is preserved by those who abide by their oaths to our Constitution. Our nation is preserved by those who know the fundamental difference between right and wrong. And I want all Americans to know that what Ms. Hutchinson has done today is not easy. The easy course is to hide from the spotlight, to refuse to come forward, to attempt to downplay or deny what happened. That brings me to a different topic. While our committee has seen many witnesses, including many Republicans, testify fully and forthrightly, this has not been true of every witness. And we have received evidence of one particular practice that raises significant concern. Our committee commonly asks witnesses connected to Mr. Trump's administration or campaign whether they've been contacted by any of their former colleagues or anyone else who attempted to influence or impact their testimony. Without identifying any of the individuals involved, let me show you a couple of samples of answers we received to this question. First, here's how one witness described phone calls from people interested in that witness's testimony. Quote, "What they said to me is as long as I continue to be a team player, they know I'm on the right team. I'm doing the right thing. I'm protecting who I need to protect. You know I'll continue to stay in good graces in Trump world. And they have reminded me a couple of times that Trump does read transcripts, and just keep that in mind as I proceed through my interviews with the committee. Here's another sample in a different context. This is a call received by one of our witnesses. Quote, "A person let me know you have your deposition tomorrow. He wants me to let you know he's thinking about you. He knows you're loyal, and you're going to do the right thing when you go in for your deposition." I think most Americans know that attempting to influence witnesses to testify untruthfully presents very serious concerns. We will be discussing these issues as a committee, carefully considering our next steps. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Ms. Hutchinson, thank you. Thank you for doing your patriotic duty and helping the American people get a complete understanding of January 6th and its causes. Thank you for your courage in testifying here today. You have the gratitude of this committee and your country. I know it wasn't easy to sit here today and answer these questions, but after hearing your testimony in all its candor and detail, I want to speak directly to the handful of witnesses who have been outliers in our investigation, the small number who have defied us outright, those whose memories have failed them again and again on the most important details, and to those who fear Donald Trump and his enablers because of this courageous woman and others like her. Your attempt to hide the truth from the American people will fail. And to that group of witnesses, if you've heard this testimony today and suddenly you remember things you couldn't previously recall, or there are some details you'd like to clarify, or you discovered some courage you had hidden away somewhere, our doors remain open. The Select Committee will reconvene in the weeks ahead as we continue to lay out our findings to the American people. The Chair requests those in the hearing room to remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted the witness and members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
All right, thus ends the 6th day of public hearings. This was a surprise day. We were told that the reason for this was because it was important and that it would, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the exact wording, but that it was because it, I think in part also because they're hoping that it's going to jostle loose. It appears as if the claim that they're making at this point is, among others, that witnesses have been asked by former members of the Trump administration to keep quiet, and Trump certainly no longer has the power to pardon them. I don't know what else they may be suggesting here, but I think the hope is that since they're going to be reconvening at this point, we've been told July 11th, that the hope is that by that point they can get some clarity from witnesses who have been refusing to testify. Sort of the biggie in my mind for what she has said is that there were multiple witnesses to Trump saying that Pence deserved it. Certainly, they have shown live interviews with Trump where he suggested, at least, that they had been acting properly, knowing that the election had been fraudulent, and that because of that, obviously they had to respond in some way. So without explicitly saying that the violence was appropriate, also saying, well, look, what would you expect when Pence refused to act on an obviously fraudulent election, which we know he knew was not true. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
That the Grand Ole Opry is a little bit smaller than I had thought it was. Every time I go by it, I'm like, that could be bigger, and it's really not. It's a pretty tiny place.
Let me. Entirely my fault. Let me rephrase the question. What are your thoughts regarding the testimony that we just heard?
I think that it is a ploy to try and get other people to come forward and testify, both to try and give them courage. Look, you don't have to worry about the consequences from the Trump end. Here's another person that's, testifying. Also, as kind of a not so subtle jab at those who are unwilling or reluctant to recall what went on. I wasn't too awfully keen about all of the hearsay that was going on in it. But I guess I kind of understand they're trying to, they're not only laying out what's going on, but they're kind of crafting a narrative as to what was going on as well, with implications when they can't outright prove something. But otherwise,
there's a lot of exceptions to the hearsay rule, at least in court, and hearsay, it needs to be considered as a very weak form of evidence in general, I think, for any number of reasons, but it still is evidence. It can be used in court depending. And whereas there seems to have been multiple witnesses to these statements and multiple people saying that this was his sentiment, and he seems to have, at least in part, echoed it. Anyways, I should have let you finish. I apologize. Please finish.
Oh, no, I mean, you're right. There are instances where it can be used. I think that the best use of it is to inform the direction of your investigation rather than trying to trot it out, because it just smacks of propaganda to me when they start doing that stuff. It's like, you didn't witness any of this. You just said, you say someone said this. I really dislike when that happens. But if you say, look, there was, they said they were in there, this is what he said, and there's like 5 other people that were in there with him, then that gives you a really great place to start, to narrow your investigation and really hone in. Okay, well, these are the 5 people that are supposed to be there. Let's work on this angle. So I think that it's great for things like that. I'm not a particularly big fan of it because I find it to be very weak, and lots of people lie for lots of reasons. So I don't like it when people do that. But I do think that this was more aimed at trying to either shame or bolster potential witnesses to come forward.
All right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think it was reasonably powerful. I don't think there was the closest in my mind that was really damning was her saying that she had a conversation with other people specifically about him saying that they had a right to feel that way, and maybe they were right. Specifically in regards to hanging Mike Pence, and I think you brought up a good point that makes a lot of sense too, which is, even if you grant him the maximal charity possible, which is that he was just a blathering idiot, and that's not that he for whatever reason he hadn't really processed the gravity, which does strike me as actually reasonably common for Trump. Trump doesn't seem to process consequences the way most people do, and he really seems to genuinely believe either he's above the consequences or the consequences don't matter. We've seen this with him from beginning to end. This is not anything new. So it's how much he had processed the consequences of what he was saying and what was going on is, I think, a fair observation. But even that notwithstanding, extraordinarily serious. And even the idea, even that he was floating the idea or considering saying that he was going to pardon everybody who had been involved in this, thank God that did not happen, but it looks like sort of more by the skin of their teeth that didn't happen. We're going to be doing tonight we're doing regular in time. We're going to be talking with Dr. Greg again about, we had him on with the biofuels. He's coming back tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern, to talk about nanobots and microbiology. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Tomorrow, we're going to be discussing what's going on, Roe v. Wade, across all of the states that have at least weighed in, and that's a good number of them. It's in some states they have actually just sort of, even though the ban has not legally kicked in the states that have trigger bans, at least not all of them, they've just stopped completely, aware that there's going to be prosecutions very rapidly. In other states, they're fighting it. We're going to get into what's going on. It is at least good to see that a number of people, I think in large part due to Thomas's concurrent opinion, are realizing that this is actually much bigger than just Roe v. Wade. So we're going to talk about that a bit, I think. And then we're also going to have to get back into, obviously, Ukraine. We've been a little negligent in that. And the reason is there's a lot going on in the U.S. And since we are based in the U.S., that's really taking priority right now. That may or may not be fair, but that is what we're doing. We're not going to drop Ukraine, however, so we got to get back into that. So obviously, a lot going on. And then, of course, I was at the conference, so that was unavailable. At any rate, that's the schedule for the week loosely. Is Andrew, any final thoughts overall on what we've witnessed and or what we're going to be covering? Not on the Opera House, specifically what we've seen, what we're covering. Yes.
Well, it's the Grand Ole Opry. I mean, I was driving right by it when you asked me that question. It just popped into my head. Sorry. It really is kind of tiny. Anyway, I think that that this is very. I agree with the committee when they're saying, and all of the witnesses are like, yeah, this could never happen. This is, this is the United States of America, and peaceful transition of power is one of the things that made, the United. Again,
oh, you cut out for a sec.
They're absolutely right.
All right.
Oh, yeah, they're absolutely right. That peaceful transfer of power, very important, and that we can't allow stuff like this to go on at all. And this needs to be stopped, and stopped now, so that people in the future don't think that, hey, this might be a possible avenue. I mean, after all, it worked for Trump, or almost worked for Trump. And the sad part is that had Trump just simply conceded the election immediately and said, hey, look, there are record numbers of people out there that hated me. They came out and supported Joe Biden just to get me out of office because I threatened them. I mean, he could have crafted this entire narrative because, he did. Biden got a record number of votes for president. And right now, he would be sitting high on his throne going, I'm going to be president again next time because of what's been going on recently. I mean, it's like he tried so hard to stay in power, coming up with all these different cockamamie schemes, or at least, seriously considering other people's cockamamie schemes about how he could possibly stay in power. When had he just sat back and done what every other president did, he would be the next president after in 2024. So, I mean, this is just ridiculous. I haven't the words to be eloquent about this because it's frustrating. It pisses me off, and it's so ironically hilarious that words fail me. Obviously.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult, and this is, I think. I've spoken with a few people who sat there and say, you read the history books and you see all the amazing things that happened, good or bad, but that people lived through, and like, now is so boring. I was like, well, it's it's the boiling frog syndrome. Later, 100 years from now, people will be reading about this, going, oh my God, what was it that happened? Holy shit! So, I think it's bigger than we have an understanding of, I think, right now, so close to it. But that's one reason we've been taken so seriously. We do appreciate everybody who's come. You can watch this any number of places. We do try to keep the commentary reasonably low because we know you're not here for us. You're here for the hearings. But on the flip side, if and when commentary is appropriate, we do interrupt and comment on it. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate that support. Please like and subscribe. It really does help us. And with any luck, there's going to be enough that we don't get these warnings. We did get another warning, but we managed to get through it. So we're good. Join us on the Discord, and you can find out when we're going to be doing our further coverage, future live streams. It's one great way to support us. Patreon is another way if you are so inclined, and if you want to find a way to give back. Giving back can also just, again, be as simple as a like and subscribe. Join the Discord and participate, or just watch. But we certainly love having people there. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern, for nanobots and microbiology. Good night, all.